All right, good evening. So we're all here, we're complete, and I hope you can all hear me. And I hope you've all had your rest last week, much as I have. So for this evening, I'll be discussing with environment and economic development. The issue of the environment and economic development actually emerged as a very important topic of concern only from the 1990s onwards. There was already concern about the environment beginning sometime in the 1980s. But in terms of its implications and interaction with economic development, it began to be taken seriously from the 1990s onwards. Okay. In our last topic, I discussed with you population and economic development, and I mentioned there that the original theory on population and economic development was that of Thomas Robert Malthus, where he saw humanity as inevitably directed towards a future of widespread famine because, as he says, population is growing faster than the ability of agriculture to increase food production. And of course, Malthus's uh, theory not uh, did not uh, become fruitful because things changed a lot in the 1800s. Okay, you have the agricultural revolution that substantially increased food production, plus the vast improvements in transport and storage that allowed food from food surplus areas throughout the world to reach the food deficit areas. And Malthus also did not foresee the demographic transition when women started having lesser and lesser children, so that his theory just disappeared. It's no longer taken very, very seriously until the end of World War II, with the emergence of many developing countries becoming independent countries in Asia and Africa from the 1940s onwards. And they are now faced with the crisis of population explosion. So you have updates on the Malthusian theory, which we discussed with the Nelson model and the Marxian theory that tries to explain um, why women decide to have lesser children. But now, certain of the elements of Malthusian theory have been revived and adapted for purposes of understanding the relationship of humanity and economic development with the environment. Okay. So it's no longer the case of population and the ability of food production to increase and feed the increase in population, but rather it's now getting to be the population and the sustainability of the planet's natural resources. Okay. One of the things to realize about economics, all the approaches, neoclassical economic analysis, stages of growth, the structural theories, and Marxian and neo-Marxian theories, all of those theories do not mention whatsoever the environment. They do not mention uh, natural resources and the like. Okay. Until Alfred Marshall um, identified, it was traditional in political economy to identify three main factors of production. You have labor, capital, and land. Land is the term for all of natural resources. The difference being that capital is produced inputs, land would be naturally occurring. But from the time of Alfred Marshall onwards, okay, the role of land is a factor of production. The role of natural resources disappears in economic analysis, which is why in many production functions they only mention they only mention labor and capital. The argument being that land or natural resources on their own cannot be productive. You need to apply produced inputs anyway. But there's also another very important reason, theoretical reason, why natural resources disappears in economic analysis. It is because that economics had assumed that land and natural resources would always be perfectly elastic in supply. And when something is perfectly elastic in supply, then there is no issue of scarcity. Therefore, there's no economic theory. There's no economic issue involved. There's no resource allocation issue involved because there is no scarcity. And that's why you have the development of theories which only focus on capital and labor. And then you have the stages of growth model that explicitly identifies a developed economy as one that has attained a stage of high mass consumption, a very high level of consumption for the mass of the population, and all the other approaches, assuming continued material abundance and continued expansion of, of the economy with natural resources being unlimited supply. From the 1990s onwards, there is now serious thought being paid to the relationship of the environment and economic development because of a growing realization that, in fact, natural resources are not in unlimited supply. So one cannot think of natural resources as being all homogeneously, perfectly elastic in supply. There are natural resources which are still perfectly elastic in supply, like sunlight, okay, like air, like water, if we consider seawater. Okay, and but there are many natural resources that have become quite inelastic. Okay. You have urban space as becoming extremely supply inelastic because, as it turns out, although the whole world is huge, human beings prefer to live in cities, and there's a tendency for for people to prefer to live in large cities. So you have the phenomenon that in any country in the world, in any country, there would be very few or just one very, very large city, but very many smaller, medium-sized cities, which means that human beings prefer to cluster in very, very small areas. So you have a rather inelastic supply of urban land. And then you have a lot of species of fish and a lot of minerals whose supply is not only inelastic, but uh, they are expected to be depletable, meaning to say, given current consumption patterns and given the known available reserves and supply of these fish species and these minerals, okay, uh, they would be expected to disappear a couple of decades. Okay. So you have fossil fuels, petroleum and coal, given current consumption patterns. Okay, they could be depleted in less than a century. And a lot of fish species like cod, like salmon and the like, whales, sharks, they've been seen as being overfished. So right now their numbers are dwindling rapidly. Okay. So if I may fast forward, there really is no straightforward theory yet that relates the environment in its totality with economic development in its totality. You have lots of attempts at providing a theory to explain particular areas of the environment, such as the analysis of the demand and supply for specific fish species and natural resources like minerals and the like. But for the moment, there is no overall theory with regards to the relationship between the environment and natural resources and economic development. Okay. Now, let's begin our analysis by going back to the usual supply and demand analysis. Okay. So, the traditional theory, you have the law of supply and demand, would say that given that we have uh, very many buyers and sellers, such that not one can control the price, for as long as we're talking here about one homogeneous good, for as long as you have perfect information on where goods are available at what price, and for as long as there's resource mobility, meaning to say the factors of production needed to increase production are available. Okay. So given these four conditions, by the law of supply and demand, it says that equilibrium, price, and quantity of a good is determined by the interaction of demand and supply. This is on a microeconomic level. Okay. You have certain factors affecting demand, certain factors that affect supply. They're independent of each other. So therefore, uh, what the equilibrium price and quantity sold will be determined by the interaction of the demand and the supply curve. Okay. As to the magnitude of the equilibrium price change whenever demand and supply curve shifts, then it depends on your relative supply and demand elasticities. Okay. Over here, we have when you have a shift in demand, the output increases by a substantial quantity, and price does not increase too much because you have an elastic supply of the good. At its extreme, when you have a perfectly elastic supply, no matter the change in demand, there will be an increase in equilibrium quantity, but the price, equilibrium price remains the same. So that's what happens when you have a perfectly elastic supply of a good. So there's no scarcity issue. It's not an economic issue. Now, if the supply is inelastic, then the increase in equilibrium output is not much compared to the increase in the equilibrium price. And that's at its extreme, when you have a perfectly inelastic supply, the price is completely demand determined. Okay? When it's perfectly inelastic in supply, the actual quantity supplied or the actual equilibrium quantity does not change. And whenever there's a change in demand, the increase in demand results in a full increase in equilibrium price. So the price here is completely demand determined. This is one of the many arguments for imposing a substantial real estate tax on lands, on properties in central business districts. Okay. It's said that you have this argument put forth by the 19th century English economist Henry George, who says that land is the only producer of value, and therefore the tax on land should be the priority. Okay, it's his arguments, for example, that have been used by, say, the cities of Sydney and Hong Kong with regards to financing their urban railway transit systems. Okay, the argument is that whenever you construct a railway station, especially in the city centers, okay, the value of the properties nearby goes up far more than elsewhere. So therefore, those properties near the stations are taxed at a much higher rate. And the tax revenue there is utilized to subsidize the train service. And that's the same in Hong Kong. Okay. The same way that when you have properties being bought and sold in central business districts like in BGC or in Ayala Makati, okay, the argument here is that they should pay a much higher tax rate, mainly because the land prices there are fully, completely demand determined. Okay, and in the absence of property taxation, the demand will shoot up even faster, and therefore the price will increase even faster. And through no effort on the part of the landowners, it just so happens that they own properties over at the central business district. Okay, so it is said that to control this rapid escalation in real estate prices in central business districts, then they should be assessed a higher tax rate. Okay? So, given this analysis, one can see that have wide variations in the nature, qualities, and properties of of natural resources and the like. Okay? It's no longer quite safe to, to therefore assume that uh, that natural resources um, are all homogeneously um, perfectly elastic in supply. Now, when we look at the demand side, here's the thing: on the demand side, the demand reflects the values that human beings attach to a particular commodity. And many commodities have what is known as single use. Okay, so you have a particular concept of value, the most basic being use value. Okay, and the most common use value that is assumed in many economic analysis is what's known as extractive use value. Okay? And this is the sort of use value assumed in many forms of economic analysis. Okay? So extractive use value is the consumption use value. Talking here about asset providing goods and services that can be extracted or harvested from the site. When you're talking about food, like burger, when you eat it, there you have it. That's the extractive use value. Or extracting the flavors, the taste, and the satisfaction you get from eating the burger. And this use value translates to a demand for the burger. Okay? And that's extractive use value. But you see, the thing about uh, use values is that there are very many commodities which have values apart from the extract. Okay? The same sort of commodity that can be used to satisfy extractive use value can also be used to satisfy other forms of use values which are non-extractive. Food, clothing, these are essentially goods which just have an extractive use value. But others do have an extractive use value, but they can also have non-extractive use values. For example, when you're talking about a forest, okay, its extractive use value is that if you chop off the trees, then it creates uh, wood industry. Okay. And at the same time, by clearing the entire forest, then it becomes available for property development. Okay. But in this case, you have extracted the use value of the woods. Okay. So what happens, the asset, which used to be a forest, is no longer there. Okay. And monetary gains here are quick and very certain. But the thing is, the forest can have other non-extractive use values, and human beings do have that use value as well. Okay. When you have a non-extractive use value, it would mean that the asset provides services without the need to extract or harvest any good. Okay. The monetary gain is not immediate, but it requires planning, research, and creativity, and the financial viability is real. The most common non-extractive use values are recreational and aesthetic. Okay? Recreational non-extractive use value is the argument that an asset provides leisure services. So, for example, the forest can provide people the with the adventure of trekking, forest bathing, tree climbing, and the like. And people are willing to pay for that sort of experience. Okay? Then you also have the aesthetic non-extractive use value, meaning to say that the asset provides a delightful sensory experience. So one may not need or want to go hiking through the forest or enjoying climbing mountains which are heavily forested, but their very presence provides a sense of beauty to one who's over there and just looking around. And people are willing to pay for this particular sort of experience. Okay? You have the case, for example, of the Butanding in Sorsogon and in Siquijor. These are the spawning grounds of the Butanding. Their extractive use value would be in slaughtering them and then butchering them for their meat and utilizing their fats for oils and the like. But you do have a non-extractive use value for all those butanding, okay? Because they are there, it's their spawning ground and like. It created business opportunities for a lot of tourism establishments around there for people who would like to see the butanding. They even have swimming activities where they can swim with the butanding and even touch the butanding. For many, that's very, very recreational. For some, just seeing the butanding from their boats is already enough of an aesthetic experience for them. Okay? So it does create value. So what I'm trying to point out here is that it's the same asset on the supply side. It's the same. But on the demand side, it has many uses, which translate to different demands. There's the extractive use value. Then there's the non-extractive use value, most common being recreational and aesthetics. In other words, all these use values create streams of income. Okay, mm, but because there are very many use values, then the demand for it increases very, very rapidly. And in the absence of controls and the like, the type of use value that would be dominant is whichever use value can pay the highest price. Okay, which is the experience of many of old buildings, old houses in cities, especially here in Manila. Okay, old houses, especially when they're in a district, have a valid non-extractive use value. There's the aesthetic experience, the beauty of looking at these old buildings and at the same time being able to enter, going inside many of these old buildings and the like, okay? Many of the old houses in Manila, just like old houses throughout the Philippines, okay, provide you with a different sensory experience because, they have very high ceilings and they have windows where the lower level of the window is open. It's called the ventanilla, okay? The combination of these wide windows and high ceilings mean that air circulates freely, which is why inside these houses, it's a very cool experience, okay? because hot air tends to rise above colder air. And the circulation of cold and hot air causes wind, air to circulate within the house, providing you the natural ventilation. So it's a very, very pleasant experience. Plus the fact that these houses were constructed in the 19th century when they could put a lot of effort into surface ornamentation and like so it's a delightful aesthetic experience. And there are many old houses that have been converted as well in restaurants. So there is that recreational element here, fine dining, a very, very beautiful setting. But they also have an extractive use value. Okay? The extractive use value being that if you extract literally the house, if you demolish the house, okay, then you're able to utilize that piece of property for more modern buildings, which generate a lot more in terms of income and like because the old houses tend to be located in city centers. Okay? So for many, the attraction of these old houses is not there being an old house, but the location. And that's why there's a huge demand for these, there's a huge demand for these old houses, mainly to demolish them and to construct a more modern high-rise building and the like. And so far, in the absence of controls, plans, and programs, the extractive use value has been the one that dominates in many parts of Metro Manila, especially in the city of Manila. Whereas in other cities like Iloilo, they've managed to preserve their old houses by controlling the extractive use value and enhancing the non-extractive use value. Okay? So what happens is that they had to have a non-market solution, which is government, the local government, making an ordinance, making a law that preserves these old structures, old houses in their exact location. So in their exact location, it's been declared a historic district, a heritage district. They don't allow for any new development. Okay. Now, so these are use values, meaning to say human beings do have uses for these products, but there's also a non-use value. Okay? The non-use value refers to the fact that humanity benefits from the continued existence of the asset. Okay? If we use the terminology from finance, okay, human beings can exercise, say, either an option value or a quasi-option value. Or an option value means that one would like to take advantage of the assets sometime in the future. So this early, you're willing to pay. Okay, in finance, it's when you purchase an option. Say you want to purchase an option on somebody's property, so that in the next 10 years, if the property owner decides to sell, since you bought an option, you have first rights to be able to purchase it. Okay. For natural assets or for heritage assets, meaning to say old buildings, old structures, and the like, option value can manifest itself in people willing to pay to a fund for the preservation of these natural assets, these heritage assets, because one would like to see them later on. Like, for example, someday you'd like to see the Great Wall, or someday you'd like to see penguins in Antarctica in their natural habitat. Okay, but there are people like myself. Okay, I really don't like to see penguins in their natural habitat, because in their natural habitat over in Antarctica, it means I'll have to brave extreme cold. You'll be there in the high seas with all those very, very strong winds in the dead of winter. No, I don't want to experience that. However, having said that, I am willing to pay for penguins to continue to exist, even though I have no desire to see them, visit them in the future. I just want the idea that they are still around. They are still existing. And that's a quasi option value. Just want to make sure that they're still around, because who knows, sometime in the future, I might overcome my fear of the cold, or they might develop well heated uh, ships so that one can actually um, enjoy going to Antarctica from a rather warm uh, situation. So that's your quasi option value. Another form of a non-use value would be the historic and the symbolic value, meaning to say some particular assets, some particular sites have a history behind them, like Luneta. That's why you have this huge controversy about the construction of the Torre de Manila, because it blocks the view of the Rizal Monument when you're over there in in Luneta. Okay? Actually, it doesn't block it; it actually mars the background of of the Rizal Monument. Then there's also buildings and assets with symbolic value. For example, you have a lot of dismay when you saw the Notre Dame de Paris, the Cathedral de Notre Dame de Paris burning 2 years ago. Okay? Because the building has a symbolic value more than its architecture aesthetic. Like, it has a very, very important uh, symbolic value. It symbolizes much of French history and the like. And it also symbolizes something, human civilization. Here in the Philippines, there is a symbolic value attached to our old churches, to the Santo Niño of Cebu, also to, say, the Philippine Eagle. Okay? And these historic symbolic values involve non-use values. You like to keep them there just to continue to exist. Okay. Another example of non-use value is, we can go back to my first example, which is the forest. A very, very important non-use value of a forest is, if you keep it as a forest, the forest acts as a natural sponge. Whenever there's heavy rain, okay, they easily absorb all that rainwater. And by absorbing much of that rainwater, they're able to minimize erosion and therefore flooding in the lower levels. And at the same time, by absorbing a lot of water, they're able to replenish the groundwater supplies. And it is from groundwater, that we're able to obtain our fresh water. So that's a very, very valuable non-use value for a forest. By keeping the forest as a forest, especially if it's in a mountain area, which is a watershed, okay? It then absorbs lots of rainwater. It minimizes erosion and therefore minimizes flooding downstream. And it's able to absorb rainwater and replenish the water in the water table from which we obtain our fresh water supplies. Okay, so so this is the supply and demand side analysis, which one can utilize on the analysis of natural resources, especially on a micro level. Okay, you have lots of these goods with different supply elasticities, and at the same time, a lot of these goods have very, very rapid increases in demand because there are multiple values associated with the same resource. The extractive use value of forests, of chopping them to extract wood, and at the same time convert the location of the forest into some form of urban property development like housing and the like. But it also has its non-extractive use value for recreational and aesthetic purposes. And it has a very, very valuable non-use value as acting as a watershed. So the demand for the area where the forest is located will increase very rapidly because of several of these values all acting. So you have different supply elasticities and you have very, very rapid increases in demand. What do you have? You have increasing equilibrium prices for a lot of assets, including natural resources. And in the absence of government intervention, the one that will win out is the one that can afford to pay the highest equilibrium price for the asset, which usually will involve extractive value. So in the main, this is the general framework for making a microeconomic analysis of, of a natural resource. Okay, to look at its supply, elasticity, and to look at the multiple values associated. Now, okay, I think I moved the I I moved quite rapid. So at this stage, uh, although it's still quite early, I suggest we have our 10-minute break now. Okay, because the last part, the one that flashed on your screen, I can do that in a short time. So I suppose right now we can have our 10-minute break. So I'll see you in a while. All right. So you can start again. So after looking at what is essentially a microeconomic approach to the analysis of natural resources and their role in the economy, um, I'll just be using this particular framework. Okay. This is developed way back in the 1990s, and I remember it was presented by Dr. Hermelino Bautista. And this would be, so far, a very, very useful chart, a very useful scheme to understand the relationship between the environment and the economy. Okay. So we look here at a chart that presents the relationship between the environment and the entire production and consumption activities of the human economy. After all, the economy is a human social system. So we have here, for example, a lot of your natural resources, and there are very, very many natural resources. Okay, for example, you have the atmosphere. Okay, the atmosphere is still in elastic supply, perfectly elastic supply if you think of it from a global point of view. But when you think of it from particular locations, there is some very, very subtle variation and change. Okay. When we're talking about atmosphere and we're talking about clean air, clean atmosphere, since the atmosphere provides us with a very valuable resource for human beings, which is oxygen, okay, clean air, and the like. Where human beings cluster, where human beings prefer to live, which is in cities, the very few large cities throughout the world, and the very, very many smaller cities. Okay. In the cities, the supply of clean air has diminished. Okay. There's a very, very high degree of pollution in cities, and also cities create what is known as a heat dome. Okay, cities are warmer compared to the areas right outside. Okay, because in cities you have this concentration of people and a very high concentration of buildings where a lot of the heat being generated by human beings and by human activity tends to be concentrated. It's right quite warm in cities. Okay, it creates what's known as a heat dome, and the air is not very clean, which is why for very many upper income families, okay, and some of the upper middle income families and the like, a demand for clean air manifests itself in the demand for vacation homes, usually in small communities far away from the cities, where given these small communities, either in mountainous areas like Tagaytay or beside the sea, such as in Batangas, it's supposed to be the air would be cleaner, which would mean a very high increase in real estate prices in these places, plus some severe restrictions on development in order to keep population density low, in order to minimize the increase in air pollution. And it also manifests itself in those who cannot afford to purchase vacation homes to at least spend weekends outside cities and the like. Okay. So this is just a manifestation of the demand for clean air. Then you have coral reefs. Coral reefs eh, are located near the seashore. They're very, very valuable as spawning grounds for a wide range of marine life. Okay. And coral reefs also are very beautiful. They have quite an aesthetic experience to seeing it. Since they're actually in shallow water, you can actually see them even when you're in a boat and admire them, their beauty. And there's also the recreational use value that there are people who go snorkeling in these places and to have a real look at all the varied marine life, both flora and fauna, that you can see in a lot of coral reefs. Coral reefs also do a valuable protection to the seashore. They are able to moderate high waves. Okay, It is said that coral reefs are able to counteract, say, tsunamis. Okay? So that although some tsunamis may be able to reach land, they would have been more destructive in the absence of coral reefs. So they're able to provide some form of protection to the coastal areas. Okay? So that's a very, very valuable uh, non-use value of coral reefs. Okay? But they also have a use value, the extractive use value, which is that coral reefs make for excellent construction materials. They make for excellent building materials. Okay? Very many of the old churches, for example, in the Visayas, especially in Bohol and the like, um, were constructed using coral rock. Okay, so a lot of these corals were extracted, ground, and turned into building materials, and they're very, very, very durable building materials and the like. But that's an extractive use value. Another extractive use value for coral reefs is that because they're located in shallow water, okay, once they are extracted, once they're harvested, then that area cannot be reclaimed. It's available for land reclamation. Okay. When a lot of the old churches in Bohol and also in Samar were destroyed, in the case of Bohol, they were destroyed by the earthquake in 2013. In Samar, they were destroyed by Typhoon Yolanda. For the reconstruction, you no longer could use their original materials. You see, by traditionally, when you're talking about restoration of old structures, old buildings, the usual rule is to use the same construction materials. But in this case, it was no longer possible because that would mean uh, the destruction of a lot of the corals in the area. So they had to opt for the using modern cement. So that many of the old churches there, strictly speaking, are no longer really, really old because they now use more modern construction materials. Okay. Mangles refer to the wetlands, the mangrove swamps, and the like. Okay. Of mangles, there are those near the sea, and then there are, of course, those inland. Okay. So mangles, like mangrove swamps, for example, these are trees that thrive in salt water. And like coral reefs, they can act as barriers to high waves to protect the coastal areas. Okay? But mangles are also the habitat for a wide range of species. Okay? They are spawning grounds for shellfish. Okay, so where you see mangrove swamps, you have lots of shellfish farming happening. Also, in many mangles, they would have nipa, okay, and their sap yields your very delightful suka, okay, the the best suka for adobo, okay, which is extracted from the sap of palms, which are growing in the mangrove swamps. Okay, for those who'd be living abroad, you have to watch out when you want to cook adobo because if you use vinegar, their vinegar usually comes from apple cider, or grapes such as the Italian vinegar. Okay. Anyway, you have coconut, olive oil. Anyway, the Italian vinegar, the dark Italian vinegar that's made from grape. If you use this to cook adobo, ang baho, the smell is really, really awful. That's why the best vinegar for adobo, for boiling in general, is our own palm vinegar. Okay. Mm. Also, swamps act as natural filtration for dirty water. If a lot of sewage water is directed towards the swamps, okay, they would filter it because these mangroves, they feed a lot on all that organic dirt, all that organic material. They feed a lot on them. So eventually they clean and filter the water. So water comes out as being very clean. Okay. So this is a very valuable non-use value once more for mangroves, for mangals. Okay. Also, there's the recreational and the aesthetic um, value to these. And again, like coral reefs, they have an extractive use value because these mangals are located near the seashore. In fact, a lot of inland mangroves are actually dry during the dry season. Okay, so during the wet season, they act as natural floodplains. Okay, so when you have mangrove swamps, okay, especially the inland swamps, okay, they're able to absorb a lot of the floodwaters and the like. Okay? In Tagalog, well, here in the Tagalog areas, when you call a place as the Tumana, okay, so those of you from Marikina, for example, know that there's a large district here called Tumana. Tumana actually means a floodplain, where before they developed Provident Village, okay, that area was also called Atumana, meaning to say that that area is very near the river, low level, which is why during the rainy season, that's where floodwaters naturally would go. Okay. And if the Tumana is still filled with swamps, still filled with mangrove swamps and the like, all those mangrove swamps can then absorb the floodwaters, okay, and minimize flooding in the downstream area. So, because they're located very close to shore on very, very dry land during the dry season, they have a valuable extractive use value in that if you cut off the mangroves, then it becomes available for commercial property development. And that's what happened. You have Provident Village, for example. Then you have the Eastwood area and the area across, where in order to keep the places from flooding, they construct such high flood barriers, which therefore means heavy flooding in the upstream area, which is in the towns of Marikina and Cainta. Okay. Since the floodwaters cannot pass through any longer, they no longer can be absorbed by what used to be the wetlands, the mangals over there in the Eastwood area and the like. Okay. Now, the forests and mountains, I've already discussed with you a while ago, their different use values. Okay. I mentioned to you that for as long as the forests are there in the mountains, then a valuable non-use value by keeping forests and mountains there is, again, they absorb rainwater, and to minimize downstream flooding and erosion. And they absorb the rainwater into the water table underneath. And the water table is that which provides us with fresh water, our fresh water supplies. The most delightful water is the water that uh, is obtained from the source of a river. You know, when the water table, okay, reaches the source, which is the start of a river flowing downwards, the water that appears right there at the source is at its cleanest and freshest. Kaya masarap siya. Okay? And that's the reason why you have such a very expensive water like Evian. Evian is a town in France where located there is the source of the Loire River, the longest river in France. Okay? And the water there in Evian is clean, pure, and fresh without any cleaning or filtration whatsoever. That's why the demand for Evian water, real Evian water, is very high. And also because of the restricted supply, the price therefore is very high. It's used not just for drinking water, but there are very, very many who use it also for bathing because they think that it has especially cleansing powers because they're naturally clean. Okay. When they were still in Malacanang, Amy Marcos was quite notorious for taking her bath in Evian water, for example. Again, she's not the only one. Okay. Now, again, forests and mountains have the extractive use value. Okay. You can cut off the forests for the wooden timber, and that particular location can be converted into real estate development, and or you can open up the mountains and extract minerals underneath. When you have a city like Singapore, it has a huge problem of obtaining its freshwater resource because it has no mountains, no forests. Okay, so Singapore gets its freshwater supplies from three main sources. You have number one, you have from rainwater. They have this large collection system. That's why their park at the center of the city, there's a huge man-made lagoon, which is very, very much recreational and aesthetic because it's beautifully designed. But the primary function of that is also to collect rainwater. And that rainwater is then used to supply the country's water supply systems. Its second main source of fresh water is desalination. Since it is an island near the sea, surrounded by the sea, it extracts salt water and desalinates the salt water. That's why you can imagine how expensive this entire process should be. Then the other one is that Singapore, like the Netherlands, which also does not have forested mountains, they recycle sewage water. They have sewage treatment plants. They spend a lot on the sewage treatment plants in order to fully clean the sewage water so that they're able to extract um, treated sewage water, supposedly to the level of purity that will make it more drinkable or potable. But that's the reason why in Singapore, people prefer bottled water because their own water, they do not trust its taste because it's either desalinated or it's treated sewage water. Okay. Then the rivers. Rivers are a source of fresh water. They're a source of fresh water. In fact, the dams here in the Philippines actually dam rivers, okay, so that these rivers can then be um, recycled to become the freshwater supply of cities and towns. Okay. Rivers also will provide a recreational experience. You can swim there, bathe there, go fishing, go boating, and there's also an aesthetic experience of being able to be walking down riverbanks and enjoying the view and the breezes coming from the rivers. But they also have an extractive use value. The rivers pass through the most cities throughout the world. That's because traditionally rivers were used as transport arteries as well. And they therefore become very efficient dumping grounds of garbage. Okay. So once rivers are used as dumping grounds for garbage, they lose their aesthetic and recreational use value. They lose their non-use value. They become highly polluted. And one spends a lot now in cleaning it up because to clean up a river does not involve just cleaning up the river, but also developing systems and mechanisms to make garbage dumpers, okay, reroute their garbage towards a different location. Okay, so it cannot be just a question of cleaning the river, but it's also finding some means of dealing with the garbage. That's the reason why it's been very difficult to clean the Pasig River because you also need to get to develop a system where the garbage that people dump on the river can be collected and directed elsewhere. That's why when you clean the Pasig River after a few days, it's dirty once more because they it's difficult to develop that mechanism to where garbage and sewage can be redirected. Okay? Then of course there's the land. Okay? Land again has multiple uses. And the most basic use is that it is the space for human beings to live in and survive and live. We are landlubbers. Okay? And as I mentioned, the more and more do people tend to prefer to live in cities, very, very small areas only, which means you have a huge demand for space inside cities, okay, inside the land in cities. So you have a very, very rapid in real estate prices over there in the in the central business district, which is why many cities throughout the world, city centers have had to become more vertical in order to create more space because people are actually after the location, not primarily the space, but the location. They need to want to locate near the city centers. And to create more space in the city centers would mean creating more space. And space would have to be created vertically, upwards and downwards. Okay. The sea also provides us with a lot of recreational use value. Then the aesthetic use value. There are very, very many people who like to live near the sea. It also has its extractive use value. It's a source of a lot of fish that we eat, and a lot of the fish are already being overfished. Their supply is dwindling at a very, very rapid pace because of this huge demand for these various fishes like tuna, cod, salmon, and the like. And that's why there's this movement towards fish farming, you know, having fish ponds and the like, which for many gourmets is a problem kasi mas masarap ang fish caught in the wild rather than fish that's cultured in fish ponds and all. Just like water that comes straight from the source. Mas masarap kaysa dun sa tubig na na that had to undergo treatment. Like the water of Metro Manila has to undergo a lot of treatment because the main source of water comes from the dams. Okay? And in order to distribute them, they have to undergo water treatment. In contrast, Davao, Cagayan de Oro, they are not very large cities compared to Metro Manila. And they also are surrounded by mountains from which they're able to obtain their fresh water directly from springs from the source. Kaya mas masarap sa Davao at Cagayan de Oro ang kafe at ang tsa kumpara dito sa Metro Manila. It's the quality of, it's in the water. The secret is in the water. People say na ang sarap daw ang kafe sa Italy, sa Rome, sa Madrid because their water comes from springs. They're very fresh water. They're not treated. In the same way, farm fish, iba ang lasa compared to fish caught in the wild. But fish caught in the wild, their numbers are dwindling. Okay. All right. So this is just the discursive analysis of different forms of natural resources, their microeconomic analysis and the like. Now on the top, you see there the economy. There's the production and the consumption side. And production is very much influenced by domestic and foreign market demand, environmental policies of government, and the current and expected profit of producer firms. Okay? And they produce in order to provide for consumption. But in the process of production, notice, okay, there's a very high level of extraction of natural resources. Okay? First, there is, of course, the use of soils for agriculture. And then there's the use of water and marine resources and solar energy for agriculture and fishery. In terms of the production of manufactured goods, okay, you have the extractive industries and the processing industries, but there's also the energy sector. The energy sector is utilized in agriculture and in manufacturing. And the energy sector extracts a lot of fossil fuels, geothermal energy, coal, other minerals, okay, which are also utilized in the extractive and processing industries, in addition to timber and other ores. The nature of modern production is that it tends to follow what is known as roundabout method of production. A straightforward method of production would mean that the producer, for example, a producer or manufacturer of wooden chairs, okay, he himself would fell the trees, plane them, process them, and chop them, plane them, and assemble all the materials to make a chair. He might even use no nails, but he might also need to extract his own varnish. So you notice how long it will take for this single chair to be completed if you have the same producer doing everything from the cutting of the wood all the way to the processing side and all that. But when you have a roundabout method of production, what happens is that the felling of the wood is done by one firm. So its processing of the wood is done by another firm. Okay. The manufacture of nails is done by another firm. The manufacture of the varnish is done by another firm, and a particular firm that assembles all of these in order to produce, design, and manufacture chairs. So what you have is what is known in economic analysis since the time of Adam Smith, where talks of specialization in production, where specialization results in a very, very high level of production and a high level of productivity. Productivity here referring to the total value of the output by a single worker. Okay. So the roundabout method of production, there's a larger level of production, greater and greater productivity because you're able to produce lots of chairs, which comes from the production of lots of processed wood and nails and varnish, which comes from the production of uh, wood being extracted from nature. And so what this means is that the roundabout method of production, which is the modern sector type of production and manufacture, is very efficient, very, very productive, but it's very, very high rate of utilization of natural resources. And in the process of all these different stages of production and consumption, they produce lots of wastes and pollutants and biomass wastes and the like, which is why lots of these wastes and pollutants, biomass waste, these are generally dumped back into nature, dumped into the atmosphere, dumped into rivers, the seas, and the like, which further compromises the quality of the natural resources. Okay. So this is the long-term problem that one has to deal with in analyzing the prospects of economic development, because there's a realization that the model of developed countries, okay, the fully capitalist economies in North America, Europe, Japan, okay, the fully modern, fully developed economies attained a level and a pattern of development with low poverty rates, which involve very, very high rates of utilization of natural resources. In fact, the natural resource per capita use of developed countries is very, very high. And it is said that if the development patterns in the rest of the world were to follow um, the experience of the developed countries in Europe, North America, and in Japan, then it would mean raising the per capita rate of the utilization of natural resources throughout the world. And it is argued that it will fully deplete the world's natural resources in a few years' time. In fact, right now, given current rates of utilization of natural resources, okay, uh, the natural resources of the entire planet Earth will not be uh, sufficient to attain that high level of material abundance in Europe, North America, and in Japan, coupled by the fact that the pollution created by modern production methods and the like have already contributed to the severe problem of climate change. And therefore, the climate change is beginning to pose the issue of what will happen to the survival of humanity if uh, the change in climate patterns would be such that it would cause melting snows, which will then raise sea levels throughout the world and therefore would flood a lot of coastal cities where the majority of the world's population happen to live. So we're now talking also about the survival now of humanity, which is why you have a lot of thought being placed towards recycling so that the wastes and pollutants, which are natural byproducts of human production and consumption activities, can be recycled into useful materials and the like. And also to begin to develop the idea of what is called ecological economics, in that the economic development leading to the survival and the material abundance of human beings have to be so designed with the reduced rate of utilization of natural resources so that more and more of the production would utilize recyclable materials and renewable energies and the like, so that human beings would thrive, would attain higher levels of material abundance, and still survive as a species by understanding the proper understanding the proper dynamics of nature and the like. So, for example, you have attempts to completely develop renewable energies to minimize the use of fossil fuels, especially since the supply of petroleum and coal, the main fossil fuels, would be seen being depleted in a few decades' time. So, in order to generate resources for energy production, there's the focus now on using renewable sources of energy, such as solar energy, wind energy, tides, and the like. Also, the use of biomass, okay, wind energy, and also you have um, lots of developments of using garbage and other recyclable materials into other worthwhile products. For example, there's a lot of, uh, you do have a lot of technologies right now where you have construction materials that utilize recycled plastics and the like. Okay. So these are the main attempts. There's the understanding, but no solid theory yet about the limits to the attainment of the material abundance of the developed countries, given the available natural resources on the planet. So we're talking here about the need for a different and a refined vision of what material abundance would be, of what a developed economy and a low poverty lifestyle would be, that utilizes less natural resources per capita than before. Okay. All right. So, so it's 7 38. So I think I can now move to our next topic just so we can complete our lectures early enough. Okay. So I'll still finish by 8 p.m. Okay. Okay. So my next topic would be agriculture. Now, agriculture, um, in the process of economic development, plays a number of very important roles. Okay? It's a supplier of food. Okay, major function of agriculture is to supply food to the rest of the society. Okay, and agriculture's ability to supply food is actually also rooted in environmental issues because the long-term productivity of agriculture is influenced by nature, by the available supply of fresh water, by the quality of the soil, okay, and by the type of fertilizers being used and the like. So environmental issues play a very, very important role in agriculture, especially its ability to supply food. The agricultural sector was also generally the main production activity of the feudal sectors or the traditional sectors, which is why previously the majority of the population are in the rural areas in agriculture, which is why agriculture can also supply labor. So you have the rural sector with its large numbers of laborers can leave agriculture and become the laborers for the manufacturing and service sectors in the towns and cities. Now, agriculture also supplies foreign exchange, okay? Because one of the major comparative advantage of economies in the early stages of their economic development is to export uh, agricultural commodities to places where there's a demand for them. Okay? Mm. That's where most developed countries started. The United States, for example, was an exporter of tobacco, cotton, iron ore, and the like. Okay, mining and quarrying being part of agriculture, uh, the primary sector. The Philippines used to be a major exporter of sugar, coconut oil, and the like. Now, since agriculture is a supplier of food and can supply foreign exchange, it means that there is substantial income. There are substantial incomes being generated in the agricultural sector. So therefore, the agricultural sector can also be a supplier of savings and will be a market for manufactured goods and services. Okay, so Japan started off its industrialization by its manufacturing sector producing a lot of goods which are in demand in the rural areas. And at the same time, Japan also encouraged rural savings by converting their postal service also into deposit taking uh, units so that it was possible for rural Japanese to make deposits into their bank accounts located in towns and cities through their postal services, where the postal service is present in all the rural areas. Okay. So the agricultural sector therefore has these five main functions in the process of economic development. But notice that they are not necessarily consistent with each other. If agriculture will be a supplier of food, that would be land and resources taken away from the production of crops for export. Therefore, it uh, also restrains the ability of agriculture to supply foreign exchange. Encouraging more savings to be generated from the agricultural sector would have to discourage rural households from being markets for manufactured goods and services. Okay. Right. So we proceed. One of the issues with regards to agriculture has to do with the issue of peasant rationality. Okay. Now, back in the 1800s, okay, there were theorists like John Stuart Mill and the like who actually proposed, they made an analysis and proposed the importance of implementing agrarian reform. Okay. And their idea was that if uh, the farmers were to own their own land, then they'd have greater incentive to raise production. Okay. Because previously, when farmers were tenants, a large portion of what they are earning goes to pay for the rent on the use of the land, plus other extractions from landlords and the like. The idea here with agrarian reform is that if farmers were to own their land, then they no longer need to pay the rent, which therefore means they would have greater income and they can therefore have the incentive to increase production, okay, in order to earn more. So that was the argument of John Stuart Mill and many Russian economists and like as to why um, it's important to implement some form of agrarian reform. And their main goal was to increase productivity and therefore increase production so that there'll be greater food supply available to the towns and cities, especially since at the time, by the 1800s, more and more people have moved to the towns and cities, and food prices were going down. They did go down in England when they abolished the corn laws. The corn laws were laws in England that restricted the importation of food. And as David Ricardo pointed out, the only ones benefiting from the restriction on the importation of food would be the landlords because they would keep on earning high rents from the tenant farmers that produce the food of England. When the British Parliament was convinced to liberalize food importation, that was because a lot of British firms invested in farms outside England. They, they had farms in Canada and Argentina. So they allowed for liberalized importation of food. So more food entered England, which collapsed the income earnings of the landlords of the United Kingdom. But still, having said that, many would say that it might be more efficient as well if you could get more and more of the tenant farmers to own their lands so that it could better assure food supply in towns and cities. Okay, although England was importing a lot of food now from Canada, from Argentina, the thing is, there could be supply disruptions, especially when the food is coming from very, very far away. So there's still something to be said for local farms being able to attain increased levels of production. Okay? And since the landlords no longer had that incentive, okay, then there'd be greater incentive if the farmlands were to be owned by the peasant farmers themselves. The thing, though, is that when they implemented land reform in some places, like those in Ireland, some places in England, and also in Russia, when they looked at limited agrarian reforms happening, the thing, though, was that they all decided that peasants were actually irrational. Okay? Were said to be irrational because rather than increasing production of food for sale in the markets that will increase food supply in the towns and cities, what happened was that many of the peasant farmers persisted in subsistence production. So rather than increasing production of crops for sale to increase their money incomes, they ended up actually increasing production for their own consumption. So this was seen as being completely irrational behavior. They were not maximizing their monetary incomes. So there was now a reaction against agrarian reform because the idea is that peasants turned out to be irrational. Here, this is when we talk about peasants who are farm households whose primary production activity is to produce for their own consumption rather than being modern sector farmers where they would be increasing production to increase their monetary profits and the like. Now, here's the thing about the issue of rationality. In economics, especially microeconomics, when you talk about rationality or rational economic behavior, it is behavior that is consistent with constrained maximization. So for a consumer, the consumer's constrained maximization problem is that the consumer maximizes utility, where utility is a function of goods consumed. Okay? The X here will be read as X squiggle, where X squiggle is actually a matrix. And in the matrix, say the first row, the vector are different X's which refer to different types of food. The second row, the second vector, the X's there represent different types of clothing, so on and so forth. Okay? So they're maximizing utility as a function of goods consumed, subject to the budget constraint. Where the budget constraint would have the income side, where the income is a question of the wage rate and the number of hours of labor that they would supply to be paid the wage. Okay? And the other side, the budget equation, is the expenditure. There's the savings and the total consumption expenditure. The total consumption expenditure would be quantities of different goods X sub I and their corresponding prices, plus the level of savings. Okay. So given this constrained maximization behavior, rational behavior would involve first, the choice of number of hours of work. How many hours of work are they willing to provide? You have lots of people quite happy with a certain level of income, so they'd only work for a certain number of hours. They'd like to enjoy their leisure time. Whereas there are very, very many others who get to be paid not on an hourly basis, but they're paid on a much higher level. However, it requires more hours of work. Yeah, but that's a choice, though, that human beings have to make. Then the next would be what goods will they purchase and how much of each will they purchase, and the level of savings that they want. So this would be rational behavior, consistent with the constrained maximization problem of the consumer. For a firm, their main constrained maximization behavior is that they're maximizing their profit pi of Q or P of Q, which is equal to total revenue, which is a function of the total output Q sold minus the cost of producing Q levels of output, subject to the main constraint, which is the production function. Q equals A, function of labor, capital, and other inputs, where the production function imposes the technical constraint of the maximum total output attainable given efficient utilization of inputs and given the particular level of technology. No matter how efficient one utilizes one's inputs, there still is a technical constraint. There's a maximum level of output that the technology will allow to be attained. Okay. So given this constrained maximization behavior, the rational firm will therefore decide what goods to produce, the level of production for each good, and the factor proportions. So these are rational behavior that would be consistent with the constrained maximization problem of consumers and of firms. And clearly, nowhere do we find that they would increase production for their own consumption. So that's why, given these two theories, the fact of peasants wanting to persist in production for consumption was seen as evidence that they're essentially irrational. Even a great thinker like Karl Marx had condemned peasants as being fonts of stupidity. And that's the reason why Marx did not think that peasant farmers can be organized to join in the revolution. That's why they tended to focus on the urban proletariat, the ones working as hired wage earners in industrial enterprises. And that's a difference between the Leninist approach to revolution and the Maoist approach. Mao argued that peasants are rational. You can organize them for the revolution. That's why the Maoist type tends to emphasize the organization of peasants and peasant level armies. Okay. Now, agriculture theorists now have pointed out something, when they argue that perhaps they're using the wrong theory. Okay? Because in the first place, a peasant farmer is not a consumer, neither is it a firm. It does both. So you were using the wrong theories. You do not use the theory of the firm and the theory of the consumer to analyze the situation of peasant farmers because they are not modern sector households or firms that are specialized in production and consumption. Okay, they are peasant farmers. They do both production and consumption activities. So that was the wrong theory. Moreover, in the social science, there is an appreciation for the fact that when a certain behavior is persisting over a very long period of time, then there must be something rational to it. So one needs to develop a theory to try and explain what the rationality is behind such a persisting behavior. Okay. For example, you have arguments as to why, say, jeepney drivers do not follow traffic rules. And by not following traffic rules, they create massive traffic jams to the inconvenience of people who are private car owners. And so they think that uh, jeepney drivers therefore would be irrational in that they don't follow traffic rules. But here's the thing, if one were to identify correctly the constrained maximization function of jeepney drivers, it would come out that there's a certain rationality to their not following traffic rules. For one thing, for jeepney drivers, if you see them as profit maximizing entities, a jeepney driver essentially does not own his or her own, there are a number of female jeepney drivers, his or her own jeep. They rent it, so there is a boundary, a daily boundary which is fixed. Okay. Then the other cost of jeepney drivers is that they of course have to pay for their own gasoline. And gasoline expense increases the slower the traffic. Okay. The faster the traffic, the more the Jeep is able to drive faster, the more it's able to make return trips. Okay. So it could earn more. So when traffic is light, it favors jeepney drivers. They can make several trips back and forth. Unlike when the traffic is very slow, when you have very slow moving traffic, okay, their gasoline expense go up and they're not able to make as many trips. Okay. So that's their cost, the boundary and the gasoline expense. And there's also uh, the traffic penalty, okay, which depends upon the probability of being caught. So the expense on traffic violations depends upon the probability that police officers will tend to catch them. This probability tends to be higher the closer we are to the Christmas season. But outside the Christmas season, the probability is actually quite low. Okay, so there's no heavy penalty effective on average for not following traffic rules. So that's the main cost element of jeepney drivers. What's their main revenue? Their main revenue comes from the number of passengers that they can take in. They cannot change the fare. The fare is fixed. The fare is set. So for them to maximize the revenue, to be able to pay for their boundary, their major fixed cost, and to pay for gasoline, their major variable cost. Okay. The only way for them to maximize the revenue is to maximize on the number of passengers they're able to take. Okay. Which is why they're going to load up on the number of riders in the Jeeps. That's why it's a huge blow for the revenues when they had to restrict the numbers for social distancing purposes. But in any case, this is the situation for jeepney drivers. Will jeepney drivers therefore follow traffic rules only to the extent that it could maximize on the number of passengers that they're able to let board in? So that's why there's rational behavior behind jeepney drivers not following traffic rules. This is in contrast to countries with develop systems of urban transit. In Europe, North America, Japan, buses operate on a regular basis. Dito sa atin sa Pilipinas, the jeeps, the private utility vehicles and the like, well, I don't know right now, but at least before the pandemic, the jeeps and private utility vehicles and the like, gagalaw lang sila pag puno na. Okay? Their uh, their turnover is a function of the last passenger. The sooner they can get the last passenger, then they can move onwards. Otherwise, you'll have to keep waiting and waiting for the last passenger just to fill in your Jeep or your PUV. Because the earnings are a function of the number of passengers. Okay? But in developed countries, you see buses and the like, they are a government monopoly. So they provide fixed salaries to their drivers. Okay. Therefore, drivers no longer need to worry about how many passengers they're going to take in. And that's why also buses follow set routes and there's a set speed limit. So there's a set time in between bus stops. They stop at every bus stop, regardless of whether there's anyone who will be getting off or coming up. Okay? So once they reach a certain stop, they stop there, they open the wait for a few minutes, whether anyone alights or gets in, they then proceed because they are given a regular wage. Okay. And for the average bus commuter, it's efficient because they know that there's always a bus that will drive by every 15, 20 minutes or so. Okay. So it optimizes as well on the use of the road to have a particular lane for buses and the like. Whereas here, the jeeps don't have their own bus lane, so they compete with other vehicles for the same road space in order to get as many passengers as they could. So, which is why, really, if you understand the constrained maximization problem, you will see that not following traffic is a very, very rational behavior on the part of G2 drivers. So, in our next class, when I'll be discussing agriculture all the more, after which I'll seg into the discussion on migration and urbanization. What we'll now look here is the development of a theory that correctly identifies the constrained maximization problem of peasant farmers to point out what are the structural features that actually encourage subsistence production as rational behavior. Just as here, you have the structural feature that encourages jeepney drivers to not follow traffic rules. The structural features being that they don't pay the regular wage, they have to pay for the boundary, the gasoline, and the revenue is constrained by the fact that the fares are fixed. So they have to maximize on the number of passengers that they're able to load. And if traffic rules do not allow them to maximize on the number of passengers that they could load, then clearly they will not follow those traffic rules. And okay, so I will stop here. It's now 8 p.m. So in the next class, I'll continue discussing the theory of the rational peasant, rational maximizing peasant, and move towards a discussion of pressing issues with regards to agriculture, and then move then to migration and urbanization. So, are there any questions or comments? Okay. All right. So, if there are none, I'll then see you all next week. Okay. So, good evening and thank you very much for your time and patience.